time I remember visiting Palestine, we were living in the Gulf, as many Palestinians did. My parents worked there, and we would routinely, yearly, go back to visit Palestine, in our case, to visit Gaza. And this particular year, this particular time, we would visit through, we'd have to cross through Jordan, and then go through the Erez crossing up there in the north into Gaza. That's how it worked back then, with all that entailed, from strip searches to long lines, and waiting and waiting and waiting, and literally hundreds and thousands of people waiting. That's my first memory of that I associate with having to visit Palestine as a child. And this regularly, why do we always have to, face all this humiliation and waiting and so forth? And our trips back home served another purpose, though, besides visiting family and keeping our connection to the land. It was a very sort of practical purpose, and it was that we had to renew what's known as the Hawiyah, our Israeli-approved, issued ID cards, without which we would be permanently exiled, like millions of other Palestinians. The Israeli military imposed this Hawiyah system on the indigenous and legitimate representatives and residents of the West Bank and Gaza and Palestine in 1967. That's when they began doing it. They conducted a door-to-door census, and anyone who was there suddenly became a resident, and people who were not, of course, who were studying abroad or visiting family for whatever reason, were suddenly excluded, which meant millions of Palestinians suddenly lost their right to return to their own homes. Now, you may be wondering why I'm bothering to explain these very onerous details to you. Well, the reason is because this Hawiyah system lies at the heart of the tight-knit and draconian mechanism by which Israel controls Palestinian movement, residency, and life in general. It allows Israel to decide which Arabs it will recognize as Palestinian, these are the definitions it will use, which couples it will recognize as families, and which qualify for unification, because if you have a Hawiyah and you marry someone who doesn't, you can't live together unless Israel allows you to and gives that spouse of yours a Hawiyah also. And thus residency, and who is allowed to move where and at what point, all inside of our own homes. So for example, if you have a Gaza Hawiyah, you cannot go to the West Bank. If you have a West Bank Hawiyah, you cannot go to Gaza, cannot go to East Jerusalem, and vice versa. So they're location specific unless you obtain, very difficult to obtain approval from Israel, which almost never happens. So that's a little bit about the Hawiyah. And the most stringent conditions are placed on East Jerusalem residents, which now, as we did in the 1980s, can face expulsion. Their IDs can be revoked from them, and thus their residency rights if they're not there for a certain amount of time, or if they don't pay a set of really absurd taxes, and so on and so forth. Rules that do not apply to the Jewish residents of the city. Now, today Israel still controls what's known as the Palestinian Population Registry, through which they issue Hawiyahs, even in disengaged Gaza. This is really important. And it means that it alone approves the issuance of those IDs, denies the cards to people, and thus residency and movement. So it still controls all of that, even after it disengaged from Gaza, including to spouses who do not have them, a process known as family unification. And I'm going to read you a little quote from Israeli journalist Amir Haas that explains this a little bit further. This control allowed Israel to deprive hundreds of thousands of Palestinians of their residency status after 1967. It allowed the continuation of marital, social, economic, religious, and cultural ties between Gaza and the West Bank until 1991, and then it severed those ties. So people are under this mistaken assumption that Gaza has just only recently been under siege, when in reality, it has been subject to forms of closure since 1991, and that has increased over time. This control allows Israel to prevent the addition of foreign residents to the population registry, and allows Israel to intervene and decide the choice of partner, the place of study, the type of medical treatment, address, quality time with children, participation in celebrations and funerals, the writing of wills, distribution of family property, and so on and so forth. Israel has the authority to ban the entry of friends and family members who are not Palestinian, not just their entry into Israel, but also into the West Bank and Gaza. And this all becomes relevant in a little bit. In the 1990s, things changed a little bit in the sense that when we were visiting Palestine, suddenly we saw it was Palestinian, authority, policemen and so forth, that were the ones at the counters, and we got excited, and we thought, oh great, now it's fine with Palestinians, we don't have to see the soldiers anymore, until we realized that they served a purely aesthetic function. So they would hand our passports back to Israeli soldiers sitting behind rooms with blackened windows, and maybe many people might remember this period, through a slip drawer so that we wouldn't see them. unless we were called for interrogation, which would routinely happen, or we heard their voices in harsh broken Arabic bellowing out to us. The occupation, I like to say, received a makeover. And over time, it would, at least in the case of Gaza, rule with an invisible hand by proxy. This is something we saw happening over the years. It was being subcontracted out, rather. Unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority establishment bought the script and played the part well. And a decade later, though, Palestinians had had enough, and this is when the second intifada happened. At this point, I was in the United States. I had come to complete my studies, and in 2003, I had just finished graduate school in Boston. By the way, I live near Baltimore now, not in Boston, but in any case, I was in Boston, and I was newly married and finished graduate school in public policy, but really, my passion was in telling stories and sharing people's stories, and I landed my dream job as a reporter for the then newly established Al Jazeera. They had just had a website at that point, Al Jazeera English. And it would take me back to my hometown in Gaza. Now, my husband, whom I met in Boston as a medical student at the time, was a Palestinian with refugee status who lacked the Hawiyya, this residency card that Israel issues and allows you to return to your own home. And thus he was denied his fundamental and my fundamental rights of return and family unification. So I made the difficult decision to go back to Gaza alone. And I went back and began to journey back and forth, and eventually I made that journey with our young son, Yusuf. Now this time I had to journey through Egypt and the Rafah crossing down there in the south. Israel then began to forbid Palestinians from Gaza to use the crossing in the north to go through the West Bank. We had to fly into Cairo, drive 5 hours to the Rafah crossing, and then wait to see if that crossing was open, and then proceed to Gaza. So this is what I began to do. It was these most ordinary of moments that I've been talking about. The ones that seem so routine and so quiet that in fact constitute the backdrop of daily Palestinian existence, being stranded by a border for days and weeks at a time, attempting to obtain a travel permit to travel to the West Bank or East Jerusalem, or attempting to obtain family unification approval for my husband, something I'm still waiting to hear from, even though we applied in 2004. This leads to a fantastic quote by Palestinian scholar Laila El Haddad, who writes, "The quintessential Palestinian experience takes place in airports, borders, checkpoints, at any one of those many modern barriers where identities are checked and verified." This is what the quintessential Palestinian experience is about. People, again, are under this assumption that the siege on Gaza is something very new, or that it's in reaction, retaliation for something, whether it's rockets or Hamas or whatever, tunnels. But the reality is, as I said, Gaza has been subject to closure for many, many years, for almost 2 decades now. And the most stringent form of that closure manifested itself in the past few years. But it actually happened right after the disengagement. It wasn't something that happened, after the Israeli soldier was captured, or after tunnels started, or after Qasser, or even after the elections. After the disengagement of 2005, there was a very clear plan to begin to separate Gaza from the West Bank. And in fact, right after Israel disengaged from the Gaza Strip, and it continued, it retained control over Gaza's borders, its airspace, its sea space. What it did is it shut down the borders, all of the commercial crossings along the eastern side of Gaza here. It shut them down for a month and a half, and it devastated the economy. And that, in many ways, was one of the factors that resulted in the election results that we saw. And it continued to close those borders. And in fact, right now, under the most stringent form of the blockade, there are no exports allowed out of Gaza. Very few imports are allowed in. No cement, no construction materials are allowed in, which means that the majority of the reconstruction that needs to be done after Qasser has yet to be done. That there's hundreds of schools that need to be built to accommodate the growing need. Those aren't able to be built either. And very importantly, there are categorical bans on people's ability to move. For example, there's a ban on students. They cannot go out of Gaza into the West Bank or East Jerusalem to study. So that's where things stand today. And just briefly, I'll explain this red line you see around Gaza. It's what's known as the buffer zone. It goes about 500 kilometers into the Gaza Strip. And you aren't allowed in there, or it's a sort of shoot to kill policy. There's no real warning. There's this pink line that's another 500 kilometers that's called a warning zone. And 1/3 of Gaza's farmland is located in that area. So shepherds and farmers and so forth can't access that land, can't rebuild that land, can't grow that land. And neither can fishermen, of course, go beyond 2 nautical miles into sea to reach the deep sea fishing. So all of those things, in fact, devastate Gaza's economy, and those are the kinds of things that result in the cycle of aid dependency and unemployment and poverty. So, understanding what the siege is about, in fact, it's much more calculated and sinister than we think. It's not merely about food. The emphasis that I always like to make is that it's a siege on freedoms. People's ability to build and to be and to live and to farm and to fish. That's what it's really about, and that results in aid dependency and so forth. The tenets of the siege are known to be no development, no prosperity, no humanitarian crisis. And that is achieved through banning exports, through preventing, development of factories and students and so on. This entry is called "What Do I Tell a 2-Year-Old?" and I had written it in December 2006 during one of these periods when we were stranded by the border. In this case, it was the Rafah crossing, my son and I, and he was at the age where he was beginning to kind of understand or having questions about, why are we always on borders? Why are we always waiting? What's going on here? And I was attempting to field his questions or avoid his questions, as it were. He keeps asking me about the border. Yusuf, I mean. He overhears me saying things. Ma'bad this and ma'bad that. And ma'bad is the word we use to refer to the Rafah crossing. And so naturally inquisitive, he asks what we are doing and why we are still here. And each question is followed by another and another. And his conversation was in Arabic, but I've translated it. Yusuf, Mama, can I ask you something? Yes, anything, my love. Why are we still here in Arish? Well, because we're waiting to enter Gaza here. But then why don't we just go to Gaza? Well, because the ma'bad is closed, my love. Why is it still closed? Silence. Mommy, why is it still closed? He insists. I don't know. I know, my dear, but do you really want to know? Do you really need to know? Well, who's closing it, Mommy? Tell me. What do I tell him? Some bad people, I say. You mean, like in the stories, like Shere Khan in the Jungle Book? Yeah, sure, I guess, like Shere Khan. But who are they? Who are these bad people? Is it the Yahud, he insists, mimicking what he's heard on the border? What do I say? I hesitate. Look, they're just some people. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, like people everywhere. But why? What did we do? I wish I knew, my dear. I wish I had all the answers so I could answer all your questions, and I wish I didn't have to answer such questions to start with. But now I do, so what can I say to you? Mommy, please tell them to open it. I tried, Habibi, Wallah, I tried. Try harder, and this time tell them Yusuf wants you to open the border. Maybe they'll listen. Okay, so here it goes. And this is actually a letter I had written to Israeli Defense Minister Amir Peretz at the time on my blog. Dear Mr. Peretz, my son Yusuf, 2 years and 9 months, would like me to inform you that he wants to enter Gaza. He asked me to tell whoever it is who is keeping it closed to open the border for him immediately. In fact, he asks me every day, and now asking is no longer sufficient. He wants answers, too. Why is the border still closed, and who is keeping it closed, and why? So, in addition to asking you to open the border, I am also writing to ask you what I can tell a 2-year-old to satisfy his insatiable curiosity. What can I tell him of borders, and occupation, and depression, and collective punishment? What would you tell him? Lying doesn't work. 2-year-olds are like natural-born lie detectors. And so he figures it's the bad guy, like in the stories we all read growing up. And now he demands to know who the bad guy is. What do I tell a 2-year-old, Mr. Peretz, about the bad guy who won't let him return home? A Palestinian mother. And actually, several Israeli journalists caught wind of this entry. One of the sort of advantages of working in a very small blogging community at the time is that there weren't very many entries and there weren't very many Palestinian bloggers writing English. One of them, Gideon, very well-known Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, wrote a long article in Haaretz about this experience, kind of illuminating the larger problem at Rafah crossing. And another journalist who worked for Yadiot Hanot actually took the letter and hand-delivered it to Amir Peretz's office. So I often had experiences like this happen to me, where I would have people say to me, we did this or we did that. In any case, am I all out of time? Oh, I have 2 minutes? Oh, great, get to hear more of me. Okay, so after the disengagement in 2005, we faced this legal quandary as Palestinians in Gaza because, suddenly people didn't know how to define us anymore. Gaza was certainly not free. It was still under occupation, legally speaking. But, we weren't always defined on, things like documents and so forth. So I was trying to book a ticket out of Cairo, online from Gaza on British Airways, and I was having a bit of a problem doing that. And so this Entry is called "I Complain, Therefore I Am," and it was initially published in The Guardian. I'm fairly certain I exist. Descartes tells me so, and before him Ibn Sina, and when my son drags me out of bed to play with him in the pre-dawn hours, I really know I do. So you can imagine how distraught I was when my existence was cast into serious doubt by a major airliner. After booking a flight online with British Airways out of Cairo, the nearest accessible airport for Palestinians here, 8 hours and a border crossing away from Gaza, I attempted to enter my passenger details, including country of citizenship and residence. Now, most people wouldn't give this a second thought, but being the owner of a Palestinian Authority passport, which one can only acquire on the basis of an Israeli-issued identification card, I have become accustomed to dealing with Kafkaesque complications in routine matters. And sure enough, in the drop-down menu of countries, I found the British Indian Ocean Territory, the Isle of Man, and even Tuvalu, but no Palestine. Now, I understand Palestine does not exist on any Western map, so I would have settled for Palestinian territories, even though Palestinian Bantustans would have been more appropriate, Gaza Strip, West Bank, or even Palestinian Authority as my pursuant to Oslo Accords passport states. But none of these options existed, and neither, it seems, did I. I was confused. Where in the world was Laila El Haddad, if not in Palestine, I wondered. Certainly not in Israel, as one of the many customer relations representatives casually suggested. I sent an email of complaint to British Airways, humbly suggesting they amend the omission. Several days later, the reply came. We are unable to assist you with your query via email. Please call your General Inquiries Department on BA.com, then select your country from the drop-down list. Instead, I opted for customer relations in the United Kingdom, whose web support told me there was no guarantee I would ever get a definite answer. I relayed the tale to my friend, whose own status as an East Jerusalemite is even more precarious than mine as a post-disengagement Gazan. Could it be, she posited, that there is no definite answer because we aren't considered definite people? I'll leave that for British Airways to answer. And I should say that after this, after a few months, they actually did put Palestine on the drop-down list. So, thank you very much.